19 minutes before 8 here on this Thursday morning. So on Tuesday, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Public Audit Amendment Act, which gives the Auditor General of South Africa powers to act against irregular spending by the state. The act came just a day before Auditor General Kimi Makwetu labelled the 2017-2018 national and provincial audit results for government departments and public entities, in which the AG says fruitless and wasteful expenditure had increased 200% compared to the previous financial year. Unauthorised expenditure increasing by 38% to 2.1 billion rand, 86% of which was a result of overspending. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure increased by 200% to 2.5 billion rand, and irregular expenditure continued to remain high at 51 billion rand. Vincent Smith, member of the Standing Committee on the Auditor General, joins us from our Cape Town studios. Vincent, always good to have you on the program. Welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Leanne, and good morning to the listeners and viewers of SABC.
All right, and also here in the Johannesburg studio, I've got Dr Thanti Mthanti from the Wits School of Governance. Welcome to you and thanks again for coming.
Thanks for having me, Leanne.
All right, so I want to begin, Vincent, let's start with you in Cape Town. The new powers that the Auditor General will be given, how significant will they be?
Well, Leanne, I think that they are a step in the right direction. You'll recall that the AG has always lamented the fact that his recommendations and or resolutions were never taken seriously. We now have a situation where the AG can refer these matters to the relevant authorities to take remedial action and also to raise a debt against the accounting officer in his personal capacity. So I suspect that consequence management will be a reality from now on.
Yeah, because consequent management is the biggest problem here. And Dr. Thanti and I were having a conversation, and I wanted to add that in, is that one of the questions you posed was, why are people doing this? And the reality is there are no consequences. In fact, a study has found that 98% of irregular expenditure of public funds is not even followed up on. So perhaps it's the consequence management that allows people to get away with this. Perhaps you have more, Dr. Thanti, add your voice to this.
Yeah, it could be a multiplicity of factors. I think you really need to drill down, particularly what's driving the deterioration in audit outcomes. Is it the issue of skills? Is it capacity? Is it the deterioration in the economy? Is it the tightness in terms of the fiscus? You know, more and more organizations running out of funds. What is driving these audit outcomes? And these audit outcomes themselves, are they linked to development? In other words, municipalities, SOEs, etc., that are getting positive audit outcomes, are they more effective in service delivery? I think Kina is trying to improve audit outcomes. Audit outcomes obviously have a very clear, well, the main developmental objective is to drive service delivery, is to improve economic growth, is to reduce unemployment. Do these audit outcomes help with that? And if so, which audit outcomes?
You know, when we talk about fruitless, wasteful expenditure, a lot of the times perhaps people get a little confused as the fact that this could be money that's being stolen or money that just disappears, but it's not that case, is it? The money can be accounted for, it is there, but it's the way that it's being spent. Is that a correct interpretation of it?
Well, fruitless and wasteful expenditure is actually fruitless and wasteful. Yeah. It could have been stolen. I think it's more irregular expenditure because it could have been deviations from prescripts, could have been deviations from laws. Not necessarily that it is a bad expenditure per se. I mean, I may disagree with most of her politics, but I think Helen Zille wrote an article once. She was driving a point around irregular expenditure that had we not had deviations. For example, during the preparations for 2010, we could not have delivered the World Cup.
Yeah.
And that would have been deemed irregular expenditure. So that's why what is interesting with the new act is that the AG can drive into what is this irregular expenditure? Is it actually stolen money? Were those deviations justified? And then in turn, I guess he can take the relevant measures, the appropriate measures.
Yeah. Vincent, let's come back to you now. In terms of this irregular expenditure, we're hearing Dr. Thanti's version of it and his interpretation of this fruitless, wasteful expenditure and irregular expenditure. Perhaps you can define it for us and give us an example of what we're referring to.
Well, I agree with the doctor. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure is money lost. Yeah. And in the main, it's because we do not stick to the supply chain management policies, internal controls are weak. So that is just really money that has been lost. And that money should be recouped. In terms of irregular expenditure and unauthorized expenditure, it is not always necessarily true that that was money that was stolen. Sometimes you would have a policy prescript that says you must have three quotations, and there isn't 3 quotations. So the Auditor General will then regard that as irregular expenditure or unauthorized expenditure in the case where there have been deviations. So I agree with the doctor that in some instances unauthorized or irregular expenditure can be justified. But fruitless and wasteful expenditure, there's no excuse.
Yeah. And that's the reality. So the new Public Audit Amendment Act, is there a framework yet to guide the Auditor General?
Yes, there is. We've made it very clear that the Auditor General will identify these weaknesses, afford the accounting authority to go and fix them up or to go and recoup the money. And the step that the Auditor General will take, if that has not happened, is then to raise a debt against the accounting authority or to refer it to a relevant authority like the Hawks, Public Protector, and so on. So there's very clear guidelines, there's very clear time frames, and there's been buy-in from everybody in terms of exactly what people can expect going forward.
Yeah. Dr. Thanti, you raised a very important issue a bit earlier, and as much as we can put these laws and these guidelines and put everything in place, do we have the right people in those positions? What I'm asking is skills. If a person is in a position, and we've spoken about this for a very long time, if they're in a position in a municipality and they don't actually have the skills to do their job, they'll continue to do wrong. So I suppose the question is that shouldn't we put the right people with the right skills in place in order to do it? Because there are laws, but they're not being followed.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, but it's much broader than skills. It's actually the capacity within those organizations, the IT capacity. It's generally capacity. And I think largely where you impose regulations on organizations that don't have the capacity or that might not lead to developmental outcomes, we have what we call in literature isomorphic mimicry. So the organization takes the institutional form. It appears like it's following all the regulations. It's meeting the audit outcomes, but it cannot carry out its tasks. So you have that danger as well, because you could have all these regulations, and now there's obviously quite a bit of coercive power. The chief financial officers, the accounting officers could find themselves owing a lot of money because of this act. So they desire... The compulsion to comply will be huge. Yeah. But can they comply? Do they have the resources? Do they have the human capital that you're talking about? And critically, are they able to still deliver their developmental outcomes that we want from them with this heavy regulatory burden? And another critical issue in terms of compliance with these audit outcomes is which ones should we really be targeting? Should we be targeting unqualified audits? Should we be targeting clean audits? And which municipalities are in a better state to have clean audits? and which ones are in a better state to have unqualified audits, and which type of outcomes link to developmental outcomes. Because we might be trying to do something quite positive and end up with very perverse outcomes.
Yeah, which is a threat, and it is a worry though. But if we keep looking, and Vincent, I'm going to come back to you now. If we keep looking at past audits and we keep on seeing the same offenders over and over again with no consequences, and the offenders that I'm referring to are the Department of Water, the Department of Health, and the Department of Education. They always seem to be the departments that are coming up when we talk about this wasteful and fruitless expenditure. You know, can we look at that and say, now, for instance, what are going to be the consequences for those departments now that this act is in place?
Well, Leanne, I think some of the weaknesses are also oversight. I think we should not run away as the executive authority or even as the legislature in terms of our own role around oversight. Of course, there are skills questions around those that are supposed to do the work on the ground. Of course, there are stringent audit requirements, but I do think that the political will from the legislature and from the executive is something that we should look at as well, because we have the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that taxpayers' monies are used for the purposes for which they were budgeted for. In terms of the serial offenders, as you call them, or as we call them, I just think that that we need to put more pressure in terms of oversight. We just need to make sure that we put the right people in their place. And ultimately, Leanne, I think that if there are consequences that people feel immediately, they will be forced to change their behavior.
Yeah. I mean, if we talk about consequences and we talk about some of the penalties that can actually come to these municipalities, to these individuals, what are we talking about?
Well, the Public Finance Management Act always had the sanction of prison and or a 5 years prison or a fine, I think. Now we are saying that the Auditor General could raise a debt against the individual and not against the organization. So it means that, Leanne, if you, the accounting authority, we would demand the money from you, which could also mean that we could, I would imagine, have the forfeiture of your assets if you aren't able to pay it, the normal debt collection measures. And of course, if it went to the law enforcement agencies, then there might be criminal charges laid against you. So those are some of the consequences that are allowed for in the new act.
Yeah, and the new act, when can we expect it to actually kick in? Because we do know on Tuesday the President signed the act, giving the Auditor General powers, but when does it actually now officially kick in?
Well, Leanne, the act is never retrospective. So I would imagine that from the new financial year, or when the Auditor General starts auditing the 2019-2020 financials, that's where we should be seeing consequences for actions that are outside of the PFMA, the MFMA. So I would imagine in the new audit session, we should be seeing consequences.
Dr. Thanti, are you happy with this act? Because just as much as I know you were saying a bit earlier, sometimes ticking all the boxes in an audit is not always a good thing. But when you look at this act, what's stated in it, and how it's going to work, are you happy with it?
I think it's something positive. The degree of consequences, what I'm highlighting might be the negative dangers of it, that you are imposing regulations on institutions who are not really clear why they are not complying. What are the drivers of non-compliance, right? And obviously, if you have this massive coercive power to force them to comply, they will have to comply. What resources will they shift towards compliance? It's questionable. How will that impact on developmental outcomes? It's questionable again. A lot of literature has been written on this, so I'm just raising particular points that we may indeed end up with perverse outcomes where you've got this massive compliance. And in South Africa, I mean, we've got a unique point in auditing where you've got so-called clean audits. Other countries, your audit is either unqualified, qualified, or you've got a disclaimer. Do we need clean audits? What are the implications of clean audits? What resources are allocated in trying to get a clean audit? How much managerial time, consultants, resources that are generally spent, some of these by some very small municipalities, to get a clean audit?
Yeah.
And is it necessary?
Yeah.
Does it drive developmental outcomes? If other countries are happy with unqualified audits, why, as South Africa, do we need clean audits?
And that's I suppose that is a big thing to worry about and to look at very, very closely. Something I want to also look at, Vincent, and I'm going to come back to you on this one, is that, I mean, if we look at the total, approximately over the last couple of years, the amount that has been wasted, the money that's been wasted by these municipalities, by these audits that have come through that have been absolutely dismal, to say the least. 160 billion rand is what we're talking about. What's going to happen? So is that gone and now we just worry about going forward, or are we going to backtrack? I mean, can we recover these funds? Is there any way that we can sort of take the act that's in place now and start implementing it for what's already gone?
Unfortunately not, Leanne. The act is not retrospective. So the act takes effect from the day it's been signed going forward. And we can't deal with matters of the past according to the act.
Sure. So
but can I just refer to something that the doc spoke about?
Yeah,
and I agree
please.
with him. That I think, and we've been asking the Auditor General for the past few years to start focusing on value for money or for performance audits. Really, it shouldn't be too much about the financial audit, but we should be asking the question, what has the 10 Rand bought? As opposed to, did you go for 3 tenders for the 10 Rand? So I tend to agree with the doctor that the Auditor General would need to refocus his attention to performance audits or to what we call value for money audits. And in that way, we would then be in a better position if service delivery is actually being improved.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's at the end of the day what people want to hear. I mean, as much as we talk about auditing and all of those things, the majority of viewers don't understand how these processes work. What they do understand are the numbers that we are quoting today, and the talk of 160 billion rand gone, the talk of the fact that the increase in 200% of wasteful expenditure could actually have paid for free tertiary education for 7 years.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the reality of what's been going on here. And we're never going to ever see that money again. And that, I think, is what is at the heart of all of this, is that we seem to blame the national leaders, the ministers, but at the end of the day, we should be looking at the premiers, we should be looking at the MECs, you should be going into the mayors and the municipalities. These are the people that should be held accountable.
No, I agree, but it's also important that we keep a sense of perspective. I think like fruitless and wasteful expenditure for this financial year that has just passed was about 2.5 billion,
Yeah.
which would be less than 0.5%. I'm saying money lost. Money we can say that's useless. It's lost. It's less than, it's less than 0.5%. Of the total amount, say, the national government, provincial governments, and municipalities would spend. So it's not like we're talking about we're losing 10% of the fiscus or 20% of the fiscus.
Yeah. But when you add it together.
When you add it together over years, but I'm saying even 2.5 billion over 10 years is 25 billion rands. So let's get a sense of perspective, because sometimes we hype the money lost as if it's these big, tremendous figures and money cannot be accounted for. It's hiding somewhere. Money lost, any cent, very important, very critical. Very important to know why it is lost. Non-compliance, very important, very critical. Very important why there is non-compliance, right? And once we start finding out why are we losing money, why is there non-compliance? What are the drivers of these issues? Then we can better know how to address them if we go that route, right? And once we know what this non-compliance, because I'll give you an example. For instance, take an organization without fiscal slack, where working capital is quite tight, doesn't have a lot of money. Say, for example, like the SABC, right? Working capital is tight. If I'm going to comply with my budget, it might mean not paying employees. So I deviate from that, I pay employees, right? I will have a negative audit finding. That is unauthorized expenditure, right? Because I've deviated from my budget because money is tight. Was it the correct decision to make? Perhaps. Was money stolen? Perhaps not. So once you know what are the drivers of these issues, you generally see with companies, the moment they go towards bankruptcy, the moment money is tight, audit results are delayed, non-compliance increases. What is the driver of this non-compliance?
Yeah.
And then you can know the appropriate measures to take. Because if, for example, sorry, maybe I'm going a bit long. If, for example,
I'm going to ask you to hurry
apply,
because we've got to get into news now. So just
Yeah.
wrap it up very quickly.
If, for example, you apply coercive measures in that instance, then I wouldn't have to pay salaries, right? I would have to make sure that I comply with whatever the budget was,
Yeah.
even if it means the institution goes under.
Okay.
And you may get that very perverse outcome
Because of what's about to happen now.
because of
Well,
these coercive measures.
Let's wait and see. And like I think we said a bit earlier, there's only way, the only direction to go right now is up, and we're hoping it's in a positive way. But Vincent Smith, thank you very much for joining us, a member of the Standing Committee on the Auditor General. They've been working very hard to get this act through. Finally, it's been signed, and we should be seeing it in the 2019-2020 year, which will give the Auditor General much more power. Dr Thanti Mthanti from the Wits School of Governance, thanks so much for coming in and teaching us this morning. I think we've learned a lot from your analysis. All right, it is gone 8 o'clock. Let's bring you up to speed with the news.